Welcome here to our session on literature. We will have two sessions actually, this one and one in the afternoon. This will be a short one with 3 papers, but before we come to that, I want to thank you for the organizers to host us here and to organize such a marvelous venue. And
I thank you, dear Olaf.
I also want to say that a pleasure and an honor to be here but in the year when we celebrate the 70th birthday of Russia.
You remember him?
Sure. He came to me when I was still in Leipzig, so he visited me. So.
Even so.
Yeah.
And so we start with your presentation.
Yes, and here I am again. So I'm going to give a paper on literary figures of encounter and transformation. Cervantes, published in 1605 and 1615, is presumably most famous opus, the Don Quixote. With this novel, Cervantes decisively shaped the outlook of modern European literature in general, and moved in particular away and beyond medieval literature, the chivalric romance and the foods literature of the Middle Ages and early modern times. At the beginnings of modern European literatures, we find thus a central figure, an anti-hero, a fool and a jester on the quest to make sense of the world and constantly seemingly failing to do so. His parody or travesty of the chivalric romance inspired, after fashion, a rich literary production, especially in later times of societal upheaval and historical caesura. Besides the figure of the Don Quixote, similar shaped figures appeared in various literatures. Suffice it to mention the German Schelm, to a lesser degree the English rogue, the Picaro in general. In Jewish literatures, the Schlemiel and the jester became established figures of the figurative inventory, for instance in the play Schmendrick or Die komische Rasene by Abraham Goldfaden from 1877. The prolificness of those literary figures or models becomes evident even at a cursory glance through word literature, composed in different times, languages, and settings. So the two word wars of the 20th century reverberate, for example, in the works of Jaroslav Hašek, Vladimir Vojnovich, the Russian Revolution and its aftermath in Ehrenburg's Picaro's novel The Stormy Life of Lasik Groychwans, or even in the Yiddish recount of Moshe Kulbach, the Semenianis. This list could be continued. Whereas the above-mentioned works showcase the immediate textual and ideational presence and productive mode of Picaro's literary figures, the following examples illustrate transmitted forms of encounter, adaptation, and appropriation. Charlotte Lennox published thus in 1752 her much acclaimed novel, The Female Don Quixote, or The Adventures of Arabella, an obvious parody of Cervantes' travesty. Besides those direct references, encompassing more often than not an inversion of plot or characters, there are yet other literary strategies of appropriation employed in translation and reception. In this way, the Don Quixote was made available to Jewish and non-Jewish readers by translations, for instance by the Hebrew translation of Chaim Nachman Bialik, and by its translation into Russian or Yiddish. Paratext, as Gérard Genette has shown for literature in generally, and Shlomo Berger has argued convincingly for early modern Yiddish literature in particular, play a decisive role in popularizing texts among an assumed readership, be it by a recommendation of an authority in the foreword, be it the contextualization and classification of a text through an adaptation, or of the title and the subtitle. So the Yiddish mock epic of Mendel Moches Forim and the brief preface of Benjamin III from 1878 was, hence, rendered in the Polish translation by Clemens Junosza as the Jewish Don Quixote, a sketch from the Jewish jargon literature. Junosza changed in this way not only the title, but also added an explanatory subtitle, placing the text distinctively in the Don Quixote tradition, and moreover, putting it in the realm of Eastern European Jewish experience and language debate. So, not changing the main title, the Spanish translator of Sorin's text, Salomon Resnick, did add, in a similar way, a subtitle. His translation, The Travels of Benjamin III, the Jewish Don Quixote, appeared in Buenos Aires in 1939. One might claim that literature is full of fools. Nonetheless, those findings raise at least three questions guiding further research. First, in what changing, transforming relationships are these figures situated, and in what ways is historical experience transferred into literary representation? Second, how and to what extent do those picaresque literary figures interact? What are the differences and what are the similarities? How, in short, does their intricate relationship reflect on the relation between Jewish and non-Jewish literatures? Third, in what ways, finally, do those literary figures relate to the comical, as in respect to aesthetics, functions, processes, historical contexts? The texts mentioned above were written in different times and were situated in different cultural and religious settings and contexts. However, all of them have crucial features in common: the wanderings and adventures of their protagonists, the life accounts of individuals, their struggles and conflicts with the respective environments, their communication strategies, eventually their self-ironic approach to life. In his essay Toward a Definition of the Picaresque, Claudia Guillen sketches some of this most distinctive features. The Picaro is typically an introspective, self-reflecting wanderer who finds himself at odds with his environment. His life story unfolds at the center of the narrative. It is no coincidence that the title of many picaresque novels begins with "The Life of." In addition, the narrator usually assumes a partial and critical viewpoint, recounting his life episodically with a focus on material elements of existence. Rather than giving a close reading of selected texts or a close discussion of selected writers, I will outline in the following some preliminary ideas and observations. I will focus on the functions of picaresque figures in the literary system, facilitating forms of interaction, encounter, and transfer. First, Don Quixote and the dimension of transmitted semantics. Beyond the recognition of the text Don Quixote as part of word literature, or in other words, as part of a humanistic reading canon, the very notion of this literary figure as an individual constantly fighting a losing battle, but never surrendering, entered the cultural imagination and became manifest as idea also among Jewish intellectuals. Pursuing the objectives of the Haskalah for Jewish emancipation, secular education, and social improvement, Grigory Bakrov became, alongside Rabinovich and Levanta, one of the founding fathers of Jewish Russian literature. Between 1871 and 73, he published his probably most famous socio-critical novel, Zapiski Evreya, Notes of a Jew. In the novel, he depicts the spatial movement, the ideational development, and emotional insecurity of a young Jewish man named Srul, the Yiddish diminutive for Yisrael, from an Orthodox shtetl milieu with its handed down traditional norms and values to an ambivalent urban setting. During his passage from childhood to adulthood, from shtetl to town, from a cheder-bocher to an educated man, Srul, or as he later calls himself, Grigory, Grisha, experiences a multitude of changes, challenges, and growing uncertainties. Bakrov earned high appraisal for this novel as much as utter rejection. He analyzed and judged his dilemma as a thinking trapped between moral obligation and societal aspiration, in a letter to Adolf Landau, then a leading figure in contemporary Jewish Russian life and thought. Quote, Please don't think of me as a fanatic, a silly patriot. I'm, in the broadest sense of the word, an emancipated cosmopolitan. If the Jews in Russia were not systematically persecuted, I would perhaps cross over to the other shore, where other sympathies and other ideas wait for me. But my process is, all in all, 4 million people suffer innocently. How can a decent man turn away from such falsehood? Perhaps those activists like me are Don Quixotes. But I prefer every true, even ridiculous Don Quixote to every railway hero such as Anne not receiving Jews, water-snorting Philistine. Calling himself an emancipated cosmopolitan who inherently rejects boundaries of thought or exclusive belonging to one sphere, who has already transcended established spheres of knowledge and who decides to move freely within various realms of society, Barkov had to realize the contemporary political realities and constraints and thus to acknowledge the failure of his self-design. Nonetheless, he dismisses the option of withdrawing. Barkov frames in this ambivalent position of a masculine writer in the Russian Empire of the 1870s, 80s, through the concept of the Don Quixote, appropriating and transposing the semantics of this figure. Second, the Harlequin and the dimension of the societal. In his novel JOODS, published in 1988 and shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, Bruce Chatwin presented the reader with a picaresque interpretation of the Harlequin. Being a stock character of the Italian Commedia dell'arte, but arguably having a much older origin in Old French literature, the Harlequin usually appears as subversive, double-natured, as a trickster wearing masks. Chatwin localized his novel in Prague, a city Hans, which has a rich Jewish history. In that way, the Talmudic scholar and Jewish mystic Rabbi Yehuda Lev ben Bezalel lived and worked here in the 16th and 17th centuries, and is often associated with the legend of the Golem. The 20th century saw the Jewish German Czech writer Franz Kafka transcend the realms of language and national belonging. The city's history encompassed on yet another trajectory, the 15th century Hussite revolution, marking one more moment of historical resilience. Against this implicit historical cultural background, Chatwin depicted the life of the eccentric Utz that unfolds, moreover, from the perspective of the Prague uprising in 1968. Utz is the offspring of an old Habsburg aristocratic family with Jewish ancestry. His grandmother, quote, recognized in Kasper a dark-haired, introspective boy with none of his father's high complexion, the pallor of the ghetto, and adored him. Latently Jewish, Utz is identified by the first-person narrator of Chet's novel as a passionate, even an obsessed collector of mice and porcelain in general, being a symbol for luxury as well as for glamorous cosmopolitanism, as in particular as a collector of figures from the Commedia dell'arte. Utz's favorite is, unsurprisingly, the Harlequin, a relationship the narrator interlocutor sketches as follows, quote, and Harlequin, the arch improviser, the zany trickster, master of the faux de farce, would forever strut in his variegated blemish, grin through his orange mask, tiptoe into bedrooms, sell nappies for the children of the grand eunuch, dance in the teeth of catastrophe, Mr. Chameleon himself. And I realized as Utz pivoted the figure in the candlelight that I had misjudged him, that he too was dancing, that for him this world of little figures was the real world, and that compared to them the Gestapo, the secret police, and other hooligans were creatures of tinsel. Historical reality, neither the NS nor the communist dictatorship, produces a decisive impact on Utz. His other world, a closed-off, a private world Utz has fashioned according to his passion, it's a private world. It's a self-fashioned enclave that helps them to avoid communication with the authorities, even the secret police. In yet another sense, this own word of UDS, with its own regulations, values and judgments, highlights the potential of resilience the Harlequin-like figure of UDS deploys. The interlocutor recounts in retrospective, quote, "As I scribbled this in my notebook, I seem to hear again UDS's nasal whisper. They listen, listen, listen to everything, but they hear nothing." The Harlequin, and so much UDS, does constantly change masks and switch codes, making them as ludic figures intangible to unambiguous inquiry and exchange. Yeah, I skipped that. And to conclude, language as elementary tool of human communication and its various misfunctions, it appears, are central to the formation and representation of picaresque figures. Hardly any other literary figure is more immersed and embedded in miscommunication, in the negotiation between different words, than the Schlemiel, the Don Quixote, or the Harlequin. The scope of his communication endeavors encompasses thus, for various reasons, all facets from successful to unsuccessful encounter and dialogue, from interrupted or disrupted to even impossible communication. This applies to the individual in general, exploring the outside world and aiming to impart sense to it, as much as to the loner or maverick trying to come to terms with his or her surroundings. The literary figures of the Schlemiel, the Sham, and the Harlequin are often ascribed to and perceived in various national literatures, and thus to and in national languages. This influential concept of nation, as formulated by Head in the 18th century, insinuating a clear demarcation between literatures and literary traditions, is put into questions by Don Quixote itself, yielding on the textual level a meta-narrative of Arab origin, and being ascribed on the discursive level a Jewish subtext. In regard to the relation between Jewish and non-Jewish literatures, Dan Miron, for one, put forward a reading that considered the various encounters and entanglements between literatures written in different languages. At a second glance, those literary figures have more in common than their differences, that is, of original tradition may suggest. They serve as literary means and devices to mark the voice of resilience, of nonconformity, the voice of a stranger through irony and ambivalence. And a last remark, as observers, commentators, and outsiders, those figures assume a critical role towards the official or mainstream discourse. They question and challenge accepted norms and values, and transgress accepted, constructed, and real boundaries. Beyond the lingual and cultural divides of Yiddish, Spanish, German, Russian, Polish, or English, that is, beyond national or nationalizing monolingualism, they create through their close, distant relationship, their critical word inquiry, a context zone, a space of encounter, exchange, and transgression. Thank you.